Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kuang, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is Kate Rose, the author of Written in the Stars, The Astrology of Soulmate, Karmic, and Twin Flame Relationships. As a therapist, relationship expert, spiritual intuitive, and astrologer, Kate uses the stars to help her clients clarify their purpose and recognize the blocks that are keeping them from living the life they are destined to live. In this conversation, we dive inside universal relationship dynamics within dating and relationships, the foundational elements of a person's astrological chart, and ways we can develop our chart and honor our strengths. You can find more side-by-side episodes at sidebysidepodcast.podbean.com. And if you'd like to connect with me about my services, please visit www.robertquanhome.com. Well, I'm really excited to be sitting here today with Kate Rose, the author of Written in the Stars. And I was thinking as a joke before we started this conversation that maybe it's written in the stars that we would connect today to talk about all things, relationships and astrology related. So welcome to Side by Side today. I'm honored for you to be here today, Kate.
Oh, thank you so much, Robert. It truly is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to see where our conversation takes us.
Where are you calling from, just out of curiosity?
I am in Massachusetts. What about you?
So I used to live in New York City.
Okay.
And then just a couple months ago, I moved to Vancouver, Canada. So,
it's beautiful there.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm loving it so far. And then just kind of starting a new chapter. And it's always nice to during turning points in our lives to think about things like astrology. I call myself, the joke is I'm an astrology girly,
I love that though.
So when did your passion or interest in astrology begin? Because I know you have a background in also like art therapy. And so when did this come up in your life?
I was a child when I really first started being interested in astrology. One of my greatest memories is kind of poring over my mom's astrology books that she had. And I don't know if I knew really what they meant at the time, but I was just fascinated with what I kind of always looked at it as like the science of the stars. Like, how can someone know so much about you just by your zodiac sign? And I think that kind of led to this idea that astrology so much really, I think, calls to us because of that human desire to be understood. And so I loved reading about it, always fascinated with it. And then it was after my divorce when I started writing more that I realized my own life was so in sync with the moon cycles, the new and full moon. That ended up being the first kind of astrology component that I really wrote about. And I mean, that really, if I wasn't a lover of astrology and the stars at that point, that definitely planted the seed. And then since then, it's just only deepened.
And you work with people to help them. The tool of astrology and looking at your own chart and knowing it is really just the power of knowing and understanding yourself. So as to attract, or to find compatibility. And I think that's why ultimately, I think some people can find dating or finding your soulmate to be kind of at times vain. But I often think that's a perfect place that will kind of tell you where the gaps are or where you're struggling and what you're truly looking for. So I think this topic of relationships is just endlessly fascinating and rich, and astrology, of course, helps with that. And I didn't know you discovered all of this at such a young age. So this really has been a part of your
really
life.
Has been a part of my entire life. Yeah, I didn't start writing about it until I started writing about everything else that I do, love, relationships, and parenting even, but the astrology has always been there.
Okay, so I have this quote that I love to read real quick, pulled from your Written in the Stars. It says here, choosing a partner purely on the basis of who you always thought you'd marry, who your family approves of, or even who is still single and available isn't the recipe for the love you seek, but it is the beginning of discovering what that recipe is. I think this is a great place to look at three primary relationship types that you talk about,
Mhm.
both in this book and I believe in your debut book as well. But can you quickly go over for listeners what the three primary relationship types are?
Of course. So, in the relationships area of our lives, and in looking at it and saying, okay, is this relationships very much kind of like what you said, they are a vehicle for self growth. They can tell us so much about who we are, where we are within ourselves, that it's almost as if the idea of relationships and the three kinds of relationships actually speak to our own personal development that we go through. And it is very unique to this current period of time because previous generations didn't have the ability or even, let's say, societal capability to look at relationships in that way.
Mm.
So the first relationship is the soulmate. That usually, often, but not always, is the first relationship that we enter into in our lifetime. The soulmate is someone that looks like the perfect person. Our parents might absolutely love them. We might come from very similar backgrounds. It's not uncommon for soulmates to even look like one another. But with the soulmate relationship, it really is just the beginning. Many of our grandparents, great grandparents, they actually married and just remained with their soulmate their entire life. For us in this lifetime, it's more of okay, we're doing what has always been done. We're in the relationship that we're supposed to quote unquote be in, but do we know who we are? And so that's the question, that's the lesson that the soulmate relationship brings in is what is our personal truth? And where does that journey begin for us of discovering who we are apart from who we've been taught to be or that we should be? With the soulmate relationship, usually it's not anything incredibly detrimental or toxic that ends the relationship. Usually the soulmate ends simply because we're like, nothing's wrong, but I don't know if this is right. And so we make that decision to honor ourselves, figure out who we are. At that point, we are kind of feeling a little bit more bold. We want to experience life. We want passion. We want excitement. We want to be able to discover who we are. And at that point, we call in a karmic partner, usually. The karmic and soulmate can switch from first to second at different times, but
Okay.
usually the soulmate does lead into the karmic. The karmic relationship will seem like the person that you've spent your whole life looking for. Sometimes even the karmic relationship will begin before the soulmate relationship is over. But the karmic relationship is one that has a high level of chemistry, high intense sexual connection. It's one where it feels like we can't live without this person. The karmic relationship is the one that we even kind of start opening up that idea of spiritual growth or the spiritual meaning of our life. But the true purpose of the karmic relationship, while the soulmate had us start asking that question of who are we if we're not who we were taught to be, the karmic relationship is the one that helps us heal our childhood wounds so that we're no longer operating from that inner child. We have a better sense of who we are. We know that we're worthy. We know that we are deserving to receive. And so after the karmic relationship, usually it is that worthiness wound that ends up having us transition out of that connection. At that point, people actually are usually feeling fairly comfortable being single. We are happier with ourselves. We're feeling more whole, more complete. We're not looking for someone to satisfy us or to save us from
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ourselves. And at that point, that's usually when we cross paths with someone. Maybe we previously knew them. Maybe it's a friend that we never looked at that way or someone that we've never met. And that begins the twin flame, third love, healthy love relationship, in which it's really about two people coming together who have reached a certain level of growth within themselves. So we're not projecting, we're not shutting down, we're not gaslighting, we're not stonewalling people. We're not getting scared that we're going to be abandoned and so we leave first. It's the relationship where we really get to kind of test out all of our growth, all of our healing. And the most important lesson with that third love is the ability to receive what we've always wanted.
Mm. I wonder how many people have come in being like, can I just skip right to the twin flame, please?
Oh my gosh, we all want to. I wish I could
Yeah.
have.
I wonder how many
So
people. Yeah.
far, I have not found a way to bypass all the lessons involved.
No, but in truth, I was laughing about that because I think deep down, sometimes we want to learn so we can avoid the pitfalls, so to speak. And yet you
Mhm.
don't speak on these three relationship types with any sort of negative, positive per
Yeah.
se. They're just going to be different experiences. And I'm being cheeky about like, oh, why would people want a twin flame? But I actually do kind of am curious about your answer. When people come to you wanting to find their soulmate, their twin flame, the love of their life, what do people say as for their reason why this journey is so important to them? What have you heard?
Most people who, let's say, are really seeking their twin flame, or they come with that intention, are usually people who, let's say, are within the karmic stage of their life, when they're wanting to feel special, when they're wanting to be chosen, when they're wanting to feel loved by someone, versus wanting to truly practice what a healthy relationship is. So most people who come into contact originally, it's because they're actually in the karmic stage and they're looking for someone to kind of validate or help them heal those childhood wounds. Ironically, the people who are at the phase, either with their twin flame, or they think they've met them, or they think that they're ready for it, they don't even speak about it in that terms. They want to learn how to communicate more openly. They want to learn how to merge lives and create something, even if untraditional, that benefits them. But it's interesting because the more that people progress, and those actually in that phase, they don't actually use the twin flame term at all. They'll use, this is my healthiest love, this is my third love.
Yeah. And I understand that phrase has some people have very strong reactions to it. And I understand
Yes.
it. Let's just say in modern era, there's good PR and bad PR for some of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And yet people will never stop seeking relationships on some way. These are just different ways of naming relationship dynamics, right? And I think that's fair to think of it that way. But I do think it's very much, when I hear people who's very much on this journey, it can bring up a lot. And I do think having something like looking at your chart, looking at your personality,
Mhm.
just working with experts can be really, really helpful. So, in your experience and in working with others, how has looking at your own chart helped people identify what types of relationship they're in and what they're looking for, etc.?
So the charts, the idea of written in the stars and looking at the charts to kind of find those answers that we're seeking, it began with the first book, because everyone was like, but how do I know which one I'm in?
Mm,
And we could list off qualities and traits, but when you're in it, you're connected. There's love, there's chemistry. And so it's really hard to be able to say, okay, I'm feeling all of this, but it says that it's this relationship. So that's where Written in the Stars came from. And so, really, what it began as comparing my own journey, comparing everybody that would possibly give me their birth charts for a very long time, and being able to kind of draw similarities, draw conclusions, and seeing the ones that popped out 100% of the time. Getting to the point where I questioned, I was like, why hasn't anyone else realized this about relationships as of yet? And I know that part of astrology is people usually use it to find out when we're going to get a job, or when we're going to make a big move, like you just did, when we're going to get rich. And this type of astrology is very much, again, kind of looking at your own self and how can we heal our childhood wounds. For me personally, as I always kind of use what I'm learning on myself, I kind of gauge it against in between.
yeah.
I was with a man that I didn't know what he was. It was on, off again for like 10 years. It was very intense at times, very heartbreaking at others, incredibly heartbreaking. I had moments of profound growth, though. That decade span represented really like a before and after in my life. But no matter what I did, no matter how I grew, no matter what changed within him, we never reached this like calm equilibrium of like, okay, we're at this place now. Now we just have to work on continuing showing up
Mm-hmm.
in this connection. There was always a crisis point, always something going
Mm-hmm.
on. And so I always would continually lay out my birth chart, which is mine, my parents, and then any other romantic partners I've
Mm-hmm.
had. And as this, I started looking more at the karmic relationship at this time with other people that I worked with. And so in myself, I realized, and I'm like, oh my gosh, not only does he have the same Venus sign, so love, as my biological father that was schizophrenic, very challenging relationship with him,
Mm-hmm.
but I had the same Venus sign as his mother, whom he was never told that he was loved.
Mm-hmm.
So together, I'm like, okay. So I started understanding, and that was a huge, as much as I knew that that's probably what our relationship was, seeing that in the chart, same way that I see it with other people. It was this moment of realizing like I wasn't doing anything wrong. This wasn't something that I had to continually work for. It was realizing I'm seeking love from my father that I never could feel like I had because of his mental illness, and that I didn't actually need this man to love me in order to know that I was lovable, to know that I was worthy, to know that my father even loved me. And so it provides, that's why there is no negative aspect in these relationships. It's just very much, what are we open to learn? What are we open to becoming better? Because the more that any of us heal or can go deeper in ourselves, that's what changes our lives. That's what changes our relationships.
Yeah. I mean, to share briefly, I would say I've gone through something similar. There are many times where I was like, is this a karmic relationship, let's say, or is this
Mm-hmm.
actually
Mm-hmm.
twin flame or the, whatever you call it, the real
Yep.
deal, et cetera, et cetera? Have I learned from all of the previous lessons
Yep.
enough to cultivate this relationship now? You're right. Looking back now, I've been with my partner for a long time, but we've had lots of ups and downs. We've had moments of
Mm-hmm.
turning points and having to choose to be together still.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like if you don't look at those pain points or why something came up, whether it's through astrology or counseling or anything else, nothing would have progressed. It would have probably just remained in that same dynamic of having to face what we're unwilling to face,
Exactly.
in some
And
ways.
that's what relationships
Yep.
do ultimately. We might not know it, but it's far more than just someone to go out with on a Friday night or to celebrate the holidays
Yeah.
with. It's we literally are being given a mirror of wherever we're at with ourselves. So often if we have an issue with the mirror, it's really an issue with ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. So for people who aren't, let's say, the astrology girlies by default,
Yes.
so they can go on Google. If you know your
Mhm.
place of birth, your date of birth, and your time of birth, you can get a pretty accurate chart online. And then what might you, let's say they've never really done this work. What are some signs or placements you'd have them start with to really understand or know about?
So in this, and a lot of times different people, depending on, their place of origin or their upbringing, a lot of people might not have the exact
Hmm.
time. And so what I suggest them is the time is actually the most flexible because it's very infrequent that like all of the planets or multiple planets would change on a single day. So if people were going to go and like Google and get their birth chart, if they don't know the time, choose like a morning, an afternoon, an evening, see what is different. And that will
Okay.
give them at least, because a lot of people are like, well, I don't know the time. What's the point? But very rarely, sometimes nothing changes over the course of the day.
Right.
And sometimes it might just be like the rising might change depending on time.
Ah, okay.
So people can still look that up. As far as, okay, you have your birth chart now in front of you. I think it a little bit differs whether someone's looking at it for their own personal development or they're looking at it from their relationship point of
Okay.
view. But in the relationship point of view, really the two most significant things that you want to look at is, do you share the same Saturn sign as your partner?
Mm.
And do you actually see much of your parents' astrology chart presented in a partner's chart? Those are the two aspects where you're going to be able to say, okay, definitively, this is a soulmate relationship if you share the same Saturn. And whether it's Venus or rising, or even just, I spoke with a woman once who her father was a Scorpio and she only dated Scorpio men and never realized the connection until we spoke.
Hmm.
So, even something like that. The idea is the person that, let's say, is a healthier relationship, there might be, let's say, one similarity to a parent's birth chart, the healthier parent, maybe someone that you were very close to that had great communication. But let's say if it was one or both parents that were very challenging, if we are repeating that in anybody else's birth charts that we're dating or in a relationship with, it means that we're still trying to heal our childhood wound. Other than that, one of the other aspects that I think is really important, just even personally for us, is the idea of the rising sign. We hear it on social media, like, your sun, moon, rising, like, this big three. But really, the rising sign, how I always describe it, is it's almost like your entire astrology chart is underneath the umbrella of whatever your rising sign
Hmm.
is. So it's not just one placement, it's your rising sign ends up being in every single other part of your chart. And a lot of times, I think people really underestimate the importance of what the rising sign can actually represent for us.
Okay, that's interesting. This is my personal anecdote because I had that experience. Thank you for
Please.
talking about the time of
I
birth.
love that.
I didn't have my original birth
Hmm.
certificate from when I was born in China. I had my American
Yep.
birth certificate that says I was born on this date, right? So so it took me a while to actually nail down the time, and it didn't change my chart that much except for my time was off by like a couple hours and it changed my
Hmm.
rising sign. Everything else was pretty much the same. But I was like, okay, let me take in this new information. What if I am this other rising sign, right?
Hmm.
It was a very interesting experience because I had really worked on really being like, I am this other thing. So I guess my point is it's interesting to look at this with some flexibility, but also just like more
Exactly.
so like curiosity, if that makes sense.
It's curiosity. And even if, let's say, you have your exact time, and this gets in a little bit more, let's say, like you said, not for like the astrology girlies, but someone
Yeah.
else. The idea with the rising sign too is that if we're looking at it, just like people can be born on the cusp of their sun sign, which means, kind of right when, let's say, the sun goes from Pisces into Aries or Aquarius into Pisces, you can have traits of both. So if, let's say, we cross over, and now based on our correct time, our rising sign is maybe the first few degrees of Cancer. That doesn't mean that you're still not going to have properties of the other signs. So it is curiosity, and it is kind of investigating what feels right for you and what aligns with where you are at in your life and what you know about yourself.
I mean, I think that's very interesting to think about that because you're right. One of the first things you talked about is are
Mhm.
you looking at this chart for yourself, like personal knowledge about who you are, or are you
Mhm.
looking at this chart to determine how to move forward in a relationship? Because then I heard then the thing to look at is almost basically like when you grew up, what were the charts of the people around you like? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and it is. I mean, that's why this, and sometimes people get confused when I asked for it, but this astrology is so different because I'm not just looking at one person's chart.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll have six, eight, I've had as much as 12, as many as 12 charts laid out in front of me. And we begin with ourselves. And then I always say parents or caregivers because some people are not raised with their birth parents. I know some people who had, people take care of them, whether it's grandma or a hired caregiver. So you want to get your caregivers. And if that means you have mom, dad, and then two caregivers, that's the best way to look at it.
Mm,
And then it's current, past, or prospective romantic partners. And the idea of that is that you can very much see your lessons. And the idea is like, let's say you attract a soulmate early on in your life, and you can see that you both have the same Saturn sign. The idea is hopefully you only need one soulmate, but you can also see, am I continuing to attract people who are having the same Saturn as me because I haven't quite learned my lesson?
mm, okay.
So it's about, and it's, what's interesting is that clarity about your relationships is really clarity about yourself too.
Yeah, very much one and the same. That's why I think, if
Hmm.
people are interested in exploring dating, you're going to make so many important discoveries either way. Even if you say I'm just on a journey to love myself, very much you might be reflecting the same thing in both paths in some ways.
It is. I actually, so I mean, my life is love astrology. This is who I am. It's what I do. And so one of something that's actually fun for me is I will watch like the dating series,
Hmm.
like The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, and then when it gets down to a few, I run their birthdays.
Mm.
And I can see exactly what people, it's something obviously I choose to do it, but it's fascinating to be able to see a little bit more clarity on the decisions that are being made, even on what we watch for entertainment.
So why is it that karmic relationships in the sense that so you have this line of like karmic relationships destroy and twin flame
Mm,
relationships heal, right?
yes.
But you are not saying that with like the destruction is therefore negative or filled with malice
Yeah.
or perhaps even necessarily traumatic, but you're talking about a great change in some way. So can you talk
Hmm.
about why you have that dynamic and understanding?
And it's so interesting because the karmic relationship is one that nobody really wants to have. But in essence, it's kind of my favorite,
That's what I'm
truthfully.
saying. I was like, let's
Um,
demystify this.
Yeah, no, I really love this karmic relationship because we can't, the soulmate relationship is really just the beginning. It's where it's like we're taking those baby steps. I really kind of equate that to like our childhood self, because childhood self married exactly who we should have married or gotten together with. And then the karmic relationship really is our inner teenager. And so we are making mistakes, we're
Mm.
being rebellious, we're potentially doing things that we wouldn't really normally do. We're throwing caution to the wind. We're doing all of this, all in an attempt to heal ourselves, even if we don't know it at the time. The karmic relationship can have a lot of unhealthy properties,
Sure.
but the reason is that so often it's because we're trying to heal what we experienced when we were children. So if we attract a karmic partner who has substance abuse, usually it's because one or both of our parents did. If it's a mental health
Mm.
issue, it again goes back to our parents. The karmic relationship is where we will repeat, whether in the astrology and or the patterns and behaviors that we experienced or went through as a child. The entire purpose of the karmic is really to heal that inner child. And that means going through the themes of abandonment, of worthiness, of, let's say, being the overparentified child for those who are the eldest in the family, or a parent who had to work constantly. The karmic relationship is very intense. That's also the one that most people think is the twin flame, until they realize that they don't have to overwork or prove themselves to be loved in the ways that they need.
Mm.
And that ends up being the caveat. But the karmic relationship, it's almost like the soulmate asks the question of who are we? And the karmic is the relationship that allows us to answer that question so that we can move on into a relationship that truly is healthy.
And so if people are constantly trying to bypass anything that they think might be karmic relationship, it's like trying to avoid coming of age or growing.
Yeah, it truly is, because after we have a child phase relationship, we have a teenage phase, the third love, twin flame, whatever we want to call it, that really is the relationship of our healing adult self. And
Mm.
it's not that the other parts of us don't exist, but there's a big difference between, let's say, if we're driving down the road in a car and our inner child's behind the wheel versus them knowing that they're safe in the back seat while the adult self is leading the way.
Once you've seen your chart and maybe you've started to gather some patterns, like, hey, I notice I am around a lot of water signs. What is that? I don't know. But you start to actually notice some of the karmic patterns, let's just say.
Mhm.
Then what? Like you start to identify some things that you can change, but you're still looking at this chart like this is your makeup in some ways. How can you
Mhm.
have this phrase, right? How can we develop our chart?
Yep, develop or undeveloped chart.
Yeah.
And so that really comes down to being able to learn our karmic lessons, which are associated with Saturn specifically, and also the South Node, which is more of that generational karma. And so we have this chart in front of us, and whether or not we go into the lessons or not, it's ours. But with every planet, with every placement, there are ways that it works best. There's places, strengths that it has, and there's also weaknesses. For instance, like Mercury and Virgo could be very detail oriented, which would be a positive, but Mercury and Virgo could also be perfectionist, and they end up making everybody around them feel less than. So, having the developed versus undeveloped chart allows us to utilize the best possible combination of any sign.
Mm.
So rather than having signs, let's say the Virgo or a Scorpio, and using and letting that like judgmental or over perfectionist nature coming out, having the developed chart allows us to be able to tap into the greatest strengths. So while the key there is learning our karmic lessons through the soulmate and the karmic relationship, the developed chart actually lets us have more control over what we do, who we are, who we become, because we understand ourselves more deeply.
Mm.
So, not clinging on to, let's say, having everything perfect around us so we feel safe, because we can make ourselves feel safe regardless of our environment.
Yeah, it's like breaking beyond what was familiar to you to actually understand yourself and therefore find
Yes.
compatibility, like you say. It's often we choose what is familiar earlier on, and what
Mm-hmm.
we're used to. And it's not until you really get to know yourself that you can call in what complements the life that you want, right? In many ways. This is such an interesting conversation. I'm having a lot of fun. So thank you for that.
I am as well. Well, and the aspect with the undeveloped and developed is that, there's people that I speak with who, let's say, have like their Venus, planet of love, in Aries, and they're like, "Oh my God, am I doomed because it's not in like Taurus or Cancer
Right,
or
right,
some
right.
like wonderful loving sign?" And it's like, no, not at all. But what's your Saturn sign in? Because it really, all of the chart, just like we said, the entire chart kind of rests under the rising sign. The chart all works together, nothing is separate. And so it's that idea of by learning our karmic lesson, by being able to kind of go through our Saturn lesson, then we're not really concerned about, let's say, the potential downside or challenges with like a Venus and Aries. Now we'd be able to see it as our strength.
Mm. Yeah. I know there's a lot of like stereotypes about different signs.
Oh my gosh, there's so many.
And quick disclaimer, I'm gonna tell everyone all my placements, but I have a lot of Gemini in my chart. And so there's a lot of things that's said about Gemini. But my joke, and I think this reflects what you're saying, that it depends on if you've healed, or if you've met a healed
Mhm.
Gemini or not, because there's the stereotype of Geminis being gossips, right? But if you've healed yourself, I would like to assert that the Geminis I know, and myself included, really understand the power of information and boundaries and confidentiality
Absolutely.
because of the same exact placements. And so it kind of depends on how you work with that placement in many ways. So,
And the rising
and the
sign,
rising
too.
sign, there you go.
That could make a big
Yeah,
difference.
yeah, yeah. Anyways, just to say, like, it's not about putting all these things and assessing them as good or bad for sure, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
No, there is no good and bad. I mean, really on this entire journey, or if we're trying to figure out who we are, we can't judge something as good or bad and actually be able to receive the lesson or purpose, because then we're placing judgment on
yeah. Hmm.
ourselves.
So you have this section about the planets, which I actually really love because I don't know if as a kid that's just grown up, a concept I've grown up around, but using the understanding the elements that are within the
Mm,
different
yes.
planets. And you do talk about how to work with knowing what elements are in your chart and then kind of maybe trying to find balance within it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So the other, I mean, we had talked about the rising sign and how that is something that fascinates me so much. But the other, one of the other aspects is the elements, because we would say mostly, let's say I'm a sun Pisces. I'm a leading water element because that's my sun sign, but that's actually inaccurate. Just because of what your sun sign is in does not mean that that categorizes or defines what your leading element is. So I have most of my placements in air, which is why you and I are talking now, why I write, because if I was a leading water element, nobody would get to hear any of the thoughts that I likely had inside. That would
Just a
keep them
puddle.
inside. I would just be a puddle. That's all I would be.
Right.
So I might be a sun Pisces, but I am definitely very strong leading air element. And so this becomes important, one, because a lot of times we might look up our horoscopes and we're like, oh, I'm an earth sign because that's my sun's in Taurus. But if you're actually having most planets in water or fire, then it's going to be completely inaccurate for you.
Mm,
But the other piece that I really love about the elements and how I describe it to people is that each one of the elements actually signifies an important part of our own thought process. So I always say that it's like the air element that will come up with the idea that we want to go on vacation. And it's the earth element that's going to make the reservations, book the flights, get all the plans in place. Then let's say there's a storm or something happened at work or with a child or family member. The fire energy is the one that says, nope, we made these plans. We're going to follow through. We're going to go. And then the water element is the one that actually kind of checks in with us throughout the process to see how we're feeling. Do we still want to go for 3 days? Do we want to go for 5 days? Do we want to cancel our plans and lounge by the beach today? And so all of the elements serve an important part, not just in our chart, but really in how we think, how we operate, how we communicate. So as long as we have one placement in every single element, it counts as kind of having this balance. The challenges occur sometimes when we have an absence of an element. And depending on what that absence is, it can be something that's felt more strongly, again, depending on what our rising sign is. But having the absence of an element really kind of completely changes how we're operating. For instance, many people who, let's say, have an absence of air will be attracted to people like myself who have an excess of it
mm,
because they're trying to find that balance. And so it's very interesting and it's helpful for us to be able to understand what does it mean if we have an absence of water and let's say no water in our chart. What does it mean if we have an absence of fire or earth? So being able to know and understand the elements in our chart, not only where our strength is and what say our leading element, but also potentially anything that we would want to look at within ourselves first before going into a relationship.
mm. So, for example, I've often thought it was fascinating to me that as a pretty somewhat air heavy sign or a person, that I can be quite compatible with fire signs oftentimes.
Mhm.
There is like we're the person who will talk them through an impulsive
Mhm.
decision, but we also get to see what happens when people are taking action before before we act on our many crazy ideas.
Exactly.
So I often talk about how if you understand that about yourself, it's like, oh, maybe,
Mhm.
I can overthink, I can get in my head, and that really doesn't serve me,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, we're not trusting our
Right.
thoughts.
So
Mhm.
if you know that about yourself, you can definitely find some support that, brings some earth energy. That's why I really admire earth signs for that reason. I'm just like,
Wait, do you have any earth in your chart?
I do, but it's like I feel
Okay.
so drawn to, and I'm a Cancer moon. So
Oh, okay.
the air and the water is very, really leads me. And I've learned to balance that out, or I have to try, right?
Be mindful of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very much. And you have water and air, so I mean,
I have one placement in all, but yeah, my moon's in
yeah,
Aquarius, and then my rising is Cancer, and then Sun Pisces.
yeah,
So
yeah. So no wonder you like the moon as well.
I know, right?
And
I'm a living diagram of why astrology is
yeah.
correct, literally.
I love this paragraph that you wrote describing the moon. I just thought it was lovely. And I'll read it real quick. The moon's journey through our sky is a language of cycles passed down for generations to help you recognize the passing of time, not by a clock, but by the natural world around you. It holds the promise of what is to come while also acknowledging the importance of what no longer is. Yeah, so one thing that I had to like come out of the closet about was like, oh, I think in addition to just taking care of my well-being and my health, my mental health, for example, pay attention to the moon cycles, maybe do some rituals
Mhm.
to allow myself to feel all my emotions, but in a different way. So yeah, I think you have some rituals and affirmations that you
I
suggest to
do.
people, and spotlighting that to say, people should really work with that because yeah.
I love the moon energy, and I know obviously people who, let's say, are a bit more skeptical at astrology, but I always go back to just that space of if the moon can control our tides and the majority of our planet is water, then we're made up of the majority of water. So obviously it's going to have some sort of an effect on us. And the moons, regardless of culture, have always, it's one of, besides, let's say, mathematics, the next thing that is celebrated worldwide in any culture is the moon cycles to varying degrees, but it has always been important. And so being able to have that kind of root and connection with our ancestors, and I think leaving behind at times technology and the clock that we always have in front of us nowadays, and realizing, especially with our emotions and all of these lessons and the phases that we go through, it can't really be marked by time. There's so many people I speak with, and they're like, oh, I hate that it took me 5 years to learn this lesson. I hate that it did that. But that's us just judging because we have just such this strict sense of time. But in all reality, many times when we bring in the moon cycles, when we bring in astrology, we're able to see that we actually do learn a lesson right when we're meant to.
Yeah, very much so. I moved around a lot when I was a kid. So I think ritual has become important to me in my own
Mm,
way. I finally realized that you can sort of make for yourself or take, inspirations from your past, your lineage. And working with a moon is really nice because it's fairly regular. It's going to happen again.
it
So it's kind of like a
is.
reminder, like, oh, yeah, have you felt your feelings lately or whatever it is, right? And I use it to sometimes towards music. I can be a little more
Mhm.
emotional and it affects my music, and also just to honor my ancestors. It can be really great for that. They all saw the moon when they were here.
Exactly. And I love that idea because even no matter what we have going on, like unless we have a blue moon, which we do in December, we have two new
Mm.
moons, but usually we'll have one new moon a month, one full moon a month. At the very least, the new moon is a chance for you to look towards a new beginning, to set an intention for something that you want to be or feel or achieve. And the full moon gives you a chance to figure out what you want to close out. What do you no longer want to continue? So it's like, even if we just look at new and full moons every month, it gives us time away from all of our schedules and all of our obligations to just focus on ourselves. Where do we want to go? What do we need to leave behind? And I think that aspect of reflection is one that will benefit ourselves and kind of our entire journey.
Yeah, that's right. Isn't that true that the saying goes, the new moon is good for manifesting and the full
Mhm.
moon is good for letting go, composting, I like to call it, so you can bring in
I
what you
love
want.
that.
And therefore
Well,
cycle.
especially the composting, because I always say like the full moon is all about like fruition and bringing something to an end, but an ending always leads to a beginning. So I like what you had mentioned about the composting because it seems to fit more of what the full moon is about. Because even if we choose to, let's say we're going to work on our anxious attachment, we're going to try to let this go under this full moon, then that means that something new is beginning, like feeling more secure, more stable within yourself.
Thank you for indulging me. I have a question which is truly for my own
Yes.
edification because
Please.
I don't really understand the North Node and South Node. So could you share a little bit, because you do write about it. So could you share a little bit about those two placements?
Absolutely. The North Node and the South Node in astrology are tied together. They are forever connected. They are not planets, which seems confusing, but they are mathematical points on the moon and they actually govern our eclipse cycles. The North and South Node, because they're always connected, the zodiac signs that they appear in are also always connected, meaning always be opposing signs. So, like Libra and Aries are opposing, Pisces, Virgo, Cancer, Capricorn, Gemini, Sagittarius. They're always going to be in each other's opposing sign. Now, the North Node represents our fate. And this is like the soul contract, the highest purpose of our life that we want to achieve, not just what we're enjoying externally in our lives, but also what we've achieved internally within ourselves. But to be able to choose the North Node and that fate and that self that we want to become, we have to learn the karmic lessons with the South Node. The South Node has this beautiful name of being the place of the soul's undoing, which sounds a lot more beautiful, I think, than it actually feels when we're going through it. While Saturn really governs over a lot of our personal karmic lessons,
Mm-hmm.
the South Node is where we're going to find the generational, the ancestral karmic lessons, the cycles that we would have had to move through in our life, let's say, because we're finally having that chance. If, we had ancestors immigrate here, whatever it might be. So the South Node carries a lot of really heavy karma, but that's also what allows us to be able to choose ourselves, to know that our truth is worthy to be spoken on, that we deserve to be able to be successful or to live the life that we feel most aligned to. And by doing that, that's what puts us at the place to be able to actually choose our fate.
Mm. There's so much to deep dive in. This is when
There really
I
is.
I'm pausing and thinking because one element that I think I'm feeling in this conversation is the element of fun. And I think this can be
Mhm.
really, really fun. And truth be told, sometimes working on this, especially if there's any sort of like a healing journey involved, it can really feel like that's the entirety of the experience. But it's
Yes.
like either whether it's on the other side or whether you've learned enough karmic lessons and developed your chart. In some ways, I'm sitting here feeling very excited and it's really fun to learn about
Mhm.
this. And it's filled with curiosity. And also, I think it can be deeply empowering when we're not automatically placing fear mind onto it and being like, is this good, bad? Do
Absolutely.
I,
Or
yeah.
judgment or any of that. It's just a lens to help us understand ourselves more deeply. So if we do feel called to make a change,
Mhm.
we'll know what direction to actually move in.
Yeah. And I do understand why some people are saying like there can be people are a little bit flippant these days with like, what sign are you and whatnot. But
Mhm.
this is very much deeper than that. And it's not about that at all.
No.
So I have two last questions for you that's sort of just about astrology
Yes.
in general and looking at your chart. As we're connecting right now, I sense there's a lot of discussion and there has been about community, whether it's
Mhm.
online, in your zip code, in your vicinity, but just about building community and finding and like really cultivating real connection in community. How can we use our chart to develop that?
When we're looking at, let's say, building a type of community, it doesn't necessarily need to be someone who has the same chart as you or anything like that. It's really about, especially if we're just looking at community and not a relationship, it's how are we all working together? And the more that we can, let's say, allow ourselves to be challenged, then that person with, let's say, their Mercury and Virgo would really be of benefit to, let's say, someone with their Mercury and Sagittarius. And so it's really about what can we bring together when, again, having that undeveloped or developed chart will significantly affect that. But overall, it's being able to look at ourselves and our chart. And the more willing that we are to learn, then it's being able to kind of embrace what our natural qualities are and not necessarily, again, see that as right or wrong, but that's just what we're bringing to the table. And we're open to see what others are going to be bringing to the table as well.
I recognize that maybe this last question is a bit of a downer, but it seemed valuable nonetheless.
Okay.
But it does make me think about the concept of conscious uncoupling as well. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so much, I always ask about that with relationship experts because that's the other side of how to find a relationship is
Absolutely.
perhaps sometimes how to end one that has run its course. So I do want to ask, how can we, let's say, be more developed in that aspect? And what has been your experience, whether it's like working with someone's chart or anything that's come up about how we can be better at that?
So, in terms of, let's say, just our personal charts and being able to work through conscious uncoupling, or even I always will say transitioning out of a relationship rather than
Right,
ending it, because many times people can be friends or they have to be co
right.
parents or they choose to be family. So, I call it always transitioning out of. One, it can be easier to do that once we have learned and kind of utilize that soulmate lesson where we're able to speak our truth more in a way where we're not being triggered so much by others. But the other aspect with the conscious uncoupling is that we are only responsible for what we bring to the situation and scenario, and that we are not responsible nor can we control whether another person wants to have a conscious unconscious coupling. So in that case, I always tell people, again, it comes down to being aware of one, Mercury signs, because that can actually be incredibly beneficial. That's the planet of
Yeah.
communication. Even Venus, let's say, because we might not, usually most relationships don't end because of a lack of love. So there is still love that's being shared there by two people. So when we're looking at the conscious uncoupling, the idea is to kind of be certain of what we are thinking, what we're feeling, what we're able to express, and then almost see it as at that point we're also stepping back. And however the other person chooses to receive it, to take it, and what they do with it has to be of their own accord. Because I do have spoken with people who want to have this beautiful uncoupling with their partner and transition out, and the other partner just isn't there at that moment. And so they get triggered, and then the person who wanted to do it ends up feeling more wounded than they did in the relationship.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So again, that's obviously a test for us and a lesson to build that more secure attachment within ourselves. But I think that it's always possible. It just really sometimes it's easier to do, let's say, when both people are more towards that second, third love, and not necessarily in the beginning of their journey because we're not yet there ourselves.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Once again, it's looking at how two charts are working together in a dynamic way. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So,
Being aware, and if even if we want to have a conversation or write a letter about uncoupling, just being mindful that, let's say you do have that Mercury, maybe you have your Mercury and Venus in both Aries or Sagittarius, it wouldn't hurt to have a trusted friend just read over or talk with them before you go about, because how early in the journey how we think that we sound or are being perceived might not actually be how it comes across to somebody else.
right, exactly. Thank you. And thank you for your time today, Kate. If people wanted to find you and connect with you and work with you, what's the best way to do that?
My website, wordsofkaterose.com, and you can also find me on Instagram, Words of Kate Rose, as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, I appreciate everything that you've shared today. And I felt like I just tried to take advantage a little bit, just get as much information as
I love it.
possible. So thank you for really sharing this information and for your education. Really. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. I had such a great time today. Thank you.
Thank you.